347 years, and Victor Ashford still couldn't look at his own portrait without flinching. The painting hung opposite his desk in the private study oils on canvas from 1823, commissioned after the Purge Wars ended. The artist had captured him at 150, barely mature by vampire standards, eyes bright with the certainty of youth. That Victor believed in absolutes, right and wrong, victory and defeat, the choices that mattered and the ones that didn't. The vampire staring back from the darkened window glass looked nothing like that painted fool. Victor's fingers traced the rim of his bourbon glass, the crystal catching moonlight through breaks in the Portland cloud cover. The amber liquid inside had gone warm an hour ago. Outside, the Ashford estate sprawled across 12 acres of coastal Maine forest land, silent except for the Atlantic's perpetual whisper against rocks. Inside the study smelled of old leather and older regrets. His ledger lay open on the mahogany desk. Numbers told stories if you knew how to read them. Vampire population in North America had dropped 40% in 50 years. Young ones fled the old hierarchies, seeking lives among humans rather than under ancient kings. His own court had fractured into factions, traditionalists clinging to the past, progressives demanding elected councils, and the vast middle ground paralyzed by indecision. Last month's session had ended with a vote. 12 of 15 noble houses wanted structural reform. Not enough to force abdication under covenant law, but enough to prove the truth his reign was ending, whether he acknowledged it or not. Victor closed the ledger and reached for a folder marked with red wax covenant violations from the past quarter. 3 vampires executed in Miami for feeding publicly. Sunchurch hunters had cornered them in a nightclub, broadcast the execution on social media before the footage could be scrubbed. Houston lost 2 families when a zealot with homemade UV grenades stormed a community center. Seattle reported increased surveillance facial recognition systems trained specifically on vampire biomarkers. The world had become too bright, too connected, too documented for creatures that required shadows to survive. His phone buzzed against the desk. 3 in the morning meant either catastrophe or someone had forgotten the concept of appropriate calling hours. The screen showed Elena Sterling's name. His head housekeeper never contacted him directly, unless absolutely necessary. Victor answered without preamble. The words came quickly, professional panic barely masked by 2 decades of service. There was a situation in the kitchen, magical signatures detected the forbidden practices. Her daughter involved required his immediate attention. The bourbon found the bar card. Victor straightened his shirt, black linen, simple, no aristocratic pretense at this hour, and left the study. The portrait watched him go, that younger self forever frozen in misplaced confidence, forever believing the hardest battles were already won. The estate's corridors stretched dark and familiar. No lights needed when you could see thermal signatures through walls, hear heartbeats 3 rooms away, taste the copper, bright fear leaking from the kitchen like blood in water. Victor's bare feet made no sound on hardwood floors. Servants' quarters occupied the east wing, separated from the noble residences by tradition and architecture. He passed sleeping staff members, their dreams broadcasting in shallow breaths and shifting pulses. The kitchen door stood ajar, golden candlelight spilling across flagstones in defiance of the estate's comprehensive electrical system. Inside, water ran in the industrial sink. Dishes clinked with rhythmic precision. Underneath those mundane sounds, something else threaded through the air. Words in a language that predated English by millennia, spoken with an accent that suggested the speaker had learned phonetically rather than through proper instruction. Old Vampiric, the ceremonial dialect, forbidden to humans after the Purge Wars when mortals had nearly weaponized dimensional magic against vampire bloodlines. Victor pushed the door fully open. Maya Sterling stood at the sink, back-turned, dark hair pulled into a functional bun that had begun losing its structure hours ago. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows, forearms deep in soapy water. 17 years old, 18 in November, if memory served, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to manual labor. A cast iron pot received her focused attention, steel wool scrubbing away carbonized residue with methodical strokes. Her lips moved constantly. The words emerging from them should not have been possible for a human throat to shape. Above her right palm, suspended in defiance of gravity and sanity, both a single water droplet hung motionless in the air. As Victor watched, the droplet began to glow. amber first warming to deep purple, rotating slowly as if caught in an invisible current. The girl's whisper intensified, cadence shifted from recitation to command, and the water responded. It reshaped itself, abandoning sphere for spiral, a miniature galaxy of liquid light rotating 3 inches above her skin. Victor had seen this magic before. Once, in 1823, in the hands of the man he'd been forced to kill. The words left his mouth before calculation could temper them. "Where did you learn those words?" Maya shrieked. The glowing droplet exploded into steam. She spun, pressed her spine against the sink's edge, eyes wide and white-rimmed like a cornered animal. Her hands found the counter and gripped hard enough that knuckles blanched. The air between them still held traces of the magic purple residue, fading but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The smell was wrong, like ozone mixed with something floral that had no business existing in this dimension.
You know the stakes as well
Victor
as I
let the
do.
door close behind him with deliberate slowness, placing his body between her and the only exit. No point pretending this was a casual encounter. The girl needed to understand exactly how much danger she'd placed herself in. The incantation she'd been using came from the Ashbinder Codex, 4th Circle sorcery. Even his court mages struggled with transmutation magic at that level, and they had decades of training behind them. Maya's mouth opened and closed twice before words formed. She could explain she hadn't meant anything by it. She was sorry. Victor crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, eliminating the distance between them before instinct could convince her to run. Running would only trigger chase reflexes he'd spent a century learning to suppress. The smell of dish soap and fear mixed with that lingering ozone and Flower's wrongness. Up close, he could see details the candlelight had obscured from across the room. Silvery marks traced along her forearms, just beneath the skin runes that shifted and moved like living tattoos barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakable to vampire sight. The marks pulsed in time with her elevated heartbeat. Hybrid bonding. The transformation had already begun. Victor kept his voice level, professional, the tone he'd used to interrogate a captured enemy combatant. She was 17 years old, human, should barely be able to sense ambient magic, let alone manipulate it. Yet he'd just watched her perform transmutation magic that would take a vampire decades to master. The girl's jaw set fear flickering into something harder. Defiance, perhaps, or simple desperation. 3 months, she said quietly, since summer. Victor laughed, but the sound carried on. 3 months. Most apprentices needed 3 years to achieve what she'd just demonstrated. Either she possessed unprecedented natural talent, or something far more dangerous was occurring. The magical pulse he'd felt earlier that evening, the discordant vibration rippling through the estate's foundations, it originated from her. Not surrounding her, but radiating outward like heat from a forge. Her aura hummed with power that shouldn't exist in a human body, power that suggested her cellular structure was being rewritten by forces she couldn't possibly understand. Victor reached for her wrist. She tried to pull away, but he was faster. Always faster, 3 centuries of predatory instinct overriding her adolescent reflexes. His fingers closed around her forearm with enough pressure to prevent escape without causing damage. The moment his skin touched hers, the world inverted. Images flooded his perception, not memories but impressions burned directly into his consciousness through the physical connection. A hidden compartment behind loose stones in the estate's 3rd-floor storage wing. A book bound in ash-gray leather pages filled with runes that glowed at her touch. Maya reading by moonlight, tracing symbols in the air, watching them spark and dance like captive stars. Her mother sleeping soundly in the next room, completely unaware her daughter was trapped in dimensional magic. And underneath it all, threading through every image like a dark current, something ancient and hungry watching from the spaces between shadows, waiting for an opportunity to cross over. Victor released her wrist and stepped back. The physical distance helped, though the after images of her magic still burned behind his eyes. The words came out flat, factual, stripped of accusation. She'd found Aldrich Varathane's spellbook. Maya's silence was confirmation enough. Victor turned away, needing movement to process what he'd just learned. His fingers found the kitchen counter's edge and squeezed until the granite groaned. The estate had been searched 12 times in the past 2 centuries. Every room examined, every wall tested for hidden compartments, every possible cache point investigated by experts in dimensional concealment. The Ashbinder Codex should have been found and destroyed decades ago, unless it hadn't wanted to be found.
Division now.
Unless it had been waiting for the right reader. Behind him, Maya's breathing had steadied into something approaching control. When she spoke, her voice carried less fear and more resignation. She didn't know what she'd done. She'd found the book by accident, cleaning storage rooms, like her mother had assigned her wall panel was loose. There was a space behind it inside was something that called her. Victor turned back. The candlelight caught the desperate hope in her expression, the naive belief that ignorance might serve as adequate defense. His response offered no comfort. Did she have any idea what she'd done? Did she understand that Aldrich Barathane didn't just teach magic? He'd opened doorways to other realms, summoned things that nearly destroyed the kingdom. And when they'd finally killed him 2 centuries ago, the cleanup had required decades and cost hundreds of lives. The girl's face went pale as realization settled. Victor continued relentless. Aldrich encoded his spells with blood, seals, safeguards that prevented just anyone from accessing the knowledge the magic only activated for those with specific potential, which meant the book hadn't been found by accident. It had chosen her, recognized something in her bloodline, or a magical signature that marked her as compatible with dimensional sorcery. Maya's hands dropped to her sides. The defiance had bled away, leaving only exhaustion in the beginning of real fear. Not the immediate panic of being caught, but the deeper terror of consequences that stretched beyond tonight, beyond punishment, into territory where her very humanity might be forfeit. The question came quietly, almost childlike, marked for what? Before Victor could answer, every candle flame in the kitchen flickered in perfect unison. A cold draft swept through the room, despite closed windows and doors. The smell of sulfur and rotting flowers' dimensional breach markers thickened the air until breathing became an exercise in willpower. Somewhere in the estate's depths, glass shattered with the distinctive musical quality of leaded crystal. Victor's fangs extended instinctively, predatory anatomy responding to threat stimulus faster than conscious thought. His hand moved to the small of his back, where he kept a silver dagger in a concealed sheath, always armed, because 3 centuries had taught him that paranoia kept you alive longer than faith. Maya's eyes had gone wide again, focused on something beyond the kitchen doorway. Her voice came out small, younger than 17. What's happening? Victor knew exactly what was happening. She'd been using Aldrich's magic for 3 months, broadcasting her presence like a lighthouse in a storm. Every spell cast sent ripples through the dimensional veil, announcing to everything on the other side that a new bridge candidate existed, young and untrained and vulnerable. And now, finally, something had answered. The response emerged cold and factual. She'd been sending out invitations, every spell, a flare visible across dimensional boundaries. And now creatures that lived in the spaces between worlds had taken notice. A shadow detached itself from the kitchen's darkest corner. Not metaphorically, but literally, a patch of darkness pulling free from its anchor point and achieving independent mobility. It moved wrong, flowing upward against gravity like oil sliding up glass. As moonlight from the window touched its surface, the shadow began to take shape. Long limbs emerged, jointed in too many places. A head that split open vertically to reveal rows of crystalline teeth. Eyes that reflected light without pupils, flat and alien and hungry. Shadeborn. Scouts from the dimensional rifts Aldrich had opened 2 centuries ago. They should have been extinct, eliminated during the Purge War's aftermath, when Victor's forces had spent decades hunting down every last creature that had crossed through Aldrich's portals. Should have been. The Shadeborn's head swiveled toward Maya with mechanical precision. Its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, jaw unhinging like a serpent preparing to swallow prey whole. The sound that emerged was not quite a shriek and not quite language, something between the two that made human eardrums ache and vampire hearing recoil. Victor moved without thought, centuries of combat experience overriding conscious decision-making. The silver dagger cleared its sheath with a whisper of steel on leather. 3 centuries ago, he'd been human, a soldier, a man who understood violence the way scholars understood texts. Vampire transformation had simply made him faster, stronger, more durable. The fundamental knowledge of how to kill remained unchanged. The blade caught the Shadeborn across what might have been a throat, or might have been something else entirely. Dimensional creatures didn't conform to terrestrial anatomy. Silver fire erupted along the wound line, blessed metal, reacting with extra-dimensional tissue and the creature's shriek changed registers from hunting, call to death agony. It dissolved into black mist before the body could hit the floor, leaving only the smell of sulfur and a dark stain on the kitchen flagstones that would probably require professional cleaning. Silence reclaimed the kitchen. Victor's breathing hadn't even elevated 347 years, and killing still came as naturally as conversation. He turned to find Maya pressed flat against the sink, the bread knife she'd grabbed held in both hands, like a talisman against forces it could never protect her from. Her entire body shook with adrenaline, crash eyes fixed on the dissipating black mist. Victor sheathed the dagger and crossed back to her. His hand closed over hers gently but firmly, prying the bread knife from her grip before shock could make her do something unfortunate. The words came out quieter than intended. Where there's one Shadeborn, others will follow. They hunt in packs, scout first, and then return with reinforcements, which meant they had maybe an hour before the rest arrived, maybe less, if the dying creature's scream had carried across dimensional boundaries the way he suspected it had. Maya's eyes finally focused on his face. The question form slowly dragged up through layers of shock. What do we do? Victor considered the options. Execute her now, cleanest, Sorstian, eliminate the beacon. Drawing Shadeborn attention, protect the estate, and everyone in it by removing the single greatest threat. Practical, efficient. Exactly what he would have done 2 centuries ago without hesitation. But 2 centuries ago, he'd also executed Aldrich Varathane, his mentor and teacher, the man who'd given him purpose beyond simple survival. That choice had been necessary and correct and had haunted him every day since. The memory of Aldrich's expression in those final moments, not surprise or anger, but something like satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting for Victor to prove himself capable of making a hard decision. Maya wasn't Aldrich. She was 17, untrained, hadn't chosen this path through malice, but through the kind of desperate curiosity that used mistakes for wisdom. The book had chosen her, which meant she possessed potential. Aldrich had specifically coded for bloodline markers or magical signatures that made her compatible with dimensional magic in ways that occurred perhaps once per generation. Killing her would be practical. Teaching her might be the stupidest decision of a very long life filled with catastrophic choices. Victor heard James Hartford's voice in his memory, his friend, his advisor, the human who'd somehow earned his trust over 3 decades of shared strategy sessions. James would say that legacy wasn't about the throne or the title, but about who you empowered when you were gone. James would say that having unprecedented talent appear in your kitchen at 3 in the morning was either cosmic joke or cosmic opportunity, and the smart play was assuming opportunity until proven otherwise. James was also dying of cancer with maybe 6 months left, which made his perspective both valuable and suspect. The dying had clarity the living often lacked, or they had desperation that looked like clarity. The decision crystallized. Victor met Maya's terrified gaze and let his voice carry the weight of 3 centuries' authority. She would come with him now immediately, no arguments and no delays. They were going to her quarters and retrieving Aldrich's book, and then she was going to become his apprentice whether she wanted to or not. The girl's mouth opened to protest or question or possibly thank him, he didn't particularly care which. His hand closed around her upper arm with enough pressure to convey urgency without causing bruising. Vampire strength required constant calibration around humans, always aware of the thousands of ways superior force could accidentally maim or kill. They moved through the kitchen door and into the corridor. Dawn was still hours away, which meant his full capabilities remained accessible. Sunlight wouldn't kill him. He was old enough that solar exposure merely weakened and pained rather than incinerated. But avoiding it had become habit so ingrained it might as well be instinct. The servants' quarters were cramped but clean, a warren of small rooms that had once housed a staff of 40 during the estate's heyday. Now barely a dozen people worked full-time, mostly humans like Elena Sterling, who'd proven trustworthy enough to know what the Ashford family truly was. Maya's room occupied the corner window facing east toward the ocean. Inside, the space showed signs of teenage occupation books, stacked on every surface, clothes draped over a chair walls covered in sketches that suggested artistic inclination. Maya moved to her bed without prompting anyone to pry up a bridge forward. The hiding place was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for, which meant she'd been lucky no one had searched her quarters in the past 3 months. The book emerged wrapped in an old pillowcase. Even through the fabric, Victor could feel its wrongness that made his ancient blood crawl power that tasted like copper and ash on the back of his tongue. The binding was indeed ash-gray leather, though leather implied the material had once been animal hide. This was something else, something that might have been organic once, but had been transformed by dimensional exposure into a substance that existed partially in this reality and partially elsewhere. Maya offered the bundle to him with both hands formal and frightened. Victor didn't take it. The book's protections would activate the moment he touched it directly. Aldrich had been too paranoid to allow his greatest work to be claimed by just anyone, even his own student. The safeguards would recognize Maya's magical signature, but not his, not anymore. Whatever connection they'd shared had died with Aldrich in Portland Harbor 2 centuries ago. Instead, he gestured for her to keep it. They were going to the observatory tower, isolated from the rest of the estate, warded specifically against dimensional intrusion after the Purge Wars. If more Shadeborn came, when more Shadeborn came, the wards would buy time. They climbed that narrow servant staircases that bypassed the main halls. The estate had been built with multiple circulation routes, ostensibly for staff to move unseen, but practically to provide escape routes during the territorial conflicts that had characterized vampire politics in the 19th century. Victor had never needed to use them for evacuation, but he'd memorized every passage anyway, because survival required knowing every exit. The observatory occupied the estate's highest point, a glass-domed tower that had once served astronomical research before becoming Victor's private training ground. The space smelled of old magic and older dust brass instruments, tarnished from decades of neglect, star charts yellowing on the walls. A stone pedestal dominated the room's center, carved with containment runes that had taken 3 mages 6 months to properly inscribe. Victor gestured for Maya to place the book there. She obeyed, moving with the careful precision of someone handling active explosives. The moment the bundle touched stone, the pedestal's runes flickered to life, faint blue light that pulsed in time with some invisible rhythm. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to gray the eastern horizon. Victor's body registered the approaching sunlight with a deep ache in his bones, centuries-old cellular memory of a transformation that had rewritten his biology at the most fundamental level. Time to establish ground rules. Time to make certain Maya understood exactly what she'd gotten herself into and what he was offering her. The explanation came in clinical detail. She was transforming the runes on her arms, were maps of spells the book had encoded directly into her flesh, even while she slept. Each mark represented magical knowledge her body possessed, but her conscious mind hadn't yet accessed. That's why she'd been exhausted lately, why school had become impossible to attend. Her biology was being rewritten faster than her psychology could adapt. Maya stared at her forearms, turning them over in the dim light. Her voice came small and lost. How long? 6 months, Victor said. Maybe less. By spring, she'd either have integrated the transformation completely, becoming something that existed partially in this dimension and partially in others, or she'd fragment consciousness torn between realities until nothing coherent remained. There were historical precedents. Aldrich had created 6 successful bridges during the Purge Wars, humans transformed into beings that could channel magic from multiple dimensions simultaneously. Most had died screaming. 2 had survived long enough to become weapons before Victor's forces had eliminated them. Only one Valera Ashbourne Aldrich star pupil had achieved stable integration. Valera had disappeared in 1854, presumed dead though her body had never been found. Maya's eyes had gone glassy with shock, the particular 1,000-yard stare that came when reality exceeded the mind's ability to process. Victor recognized the expression from decades of watching soldiers encounter their first real combat. Some broke, some adapted. The ones who survived were usually the ones who could accept horror as new baseline rather than temporary aberration. The question emerged barely audible. What happens to me? Victor let the silence stretch, making her wait for the answer, making her understand that what came next would define the rest of her substantially shortened life. 2 options, he said finally. First, he executes her now clean and quick, prevents the transformation from completing, protects the estate from becoming a beacon that drew dimensional predators. Maya's breath caught. Second option, she becomes his apprentice, officially, and formally he teaches her control and discipline and theory. Everything Aldrich's book couldn't provide. They seal the rifts she'd accidentally begun opening, hunt down every Shadeborn that had caught her scent, and figure out exactly what Ultralight had intended her to become. The choice was hers. Death now, or probable death later, but later came with a chance of survival if she proved capable of learning faster than the transformation consumed her. He'd give her 10 seconds to decide. Maya's expression cycled through denial and desperation, and something harder to identify. Perhaps the first glimpse of the person she might become if she survived long enough to grow into her power. When she spoke, her voice had steadied into something approaching resolve. She chose life, whatever that meant now. Victor nodded once, accepting her decision and all the chaos it would inevitably bring. His hand moved in a gesture half remembered from ceremonies he'd attended centuries ago, formal acknowledgement of apprenticeship bonds that predated the Purge Wars by generations. They had work to do and limited time to prepare. The sun was rising, which meant he'd be weakened for the next 12 hours. The estate wards would hold against casual dimensional intrusion, but not sustained assault. Maya needed immediate instruction in suppressing her magical aura before more Shapeborn traced her signature. And somewhere in the estate below the vampire court would be waking to discover their king had taken a human apprentice without consulting the council. That conversation would be unpleasant at best, insurrectionary at worst. Victor moved to the observatory's eastern window and watched dawn break over the Atlantic. The sky bled from black to gray to pale gold, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. His skin prickled with the beginning of solar discomfort, manageable but present reminder that he was creature of darkness, regardless of how civilized he pretended to be. Behind him, Maya stood beside the pedestal, one hand resting lightly on Aldrich's book, probably not realizing she was drawing comfort from the same object that was killing her. 347 years, and Victor Ashford still didn't know if he was saving this girl or condemning her. Perhaps there was no difference. Perhaps that had always been the fundamental truth he'd been too proud or too frightened to accept. Legacy wasn't about making the right choices. Legacy was about making choices and accepting whatever came after. The sun cleared the horizon. Morning had arrived whether they were ready or not. By evening, the vampire court would convene an emergency session. Victor had sent formal notices an hour after dawn, terse messages that provided minimal detail, but maximum urgency. Attendance mandatory. Dissent anticipated. Violence possible. He'd spent the daylight hours in his study shades, drawn against the weakening sunlight, reviewing files that hadn't been opened in decades. Aldrich Varathane's trial records. Testimony from the Purge Wars. Names of vampires who'd sided with the dimensional mages against their own kind, believing that cooperation with humanity's magical practitioners could create a stronger society than separation ever would. Most of those names were followed by execution dates. History had a way of repeating itself for those too stubborn to learn from it. The throne hall occupied the estate's ceremonial wing, a vast chamber designed to intimidate through scale and shadow. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into darkness 40 feet overhead. Pillars carved from single pieces of granite marched along both walls, each one depicting scenes from vampire history, territorial wars, treaty signings, the occasional execution rendered in loving detail. The throne itself was relatively modest black marble with silver inlay positioned on a dais that elevated the occupant just enough to establish dominance without suggesting insecurity. Victor took his seat as the nobles began arriving. Marcus Blackwood entered first as always. 270 years old, turned during the colonial period when Virginia was still wild territory and survival meant knowing how to kill a fish. Marcus moved with military precision, every step economical. Posture, parade ground straight, despite centuries away from his mortal service. Silver hair pulled back in a queue that had been fashionable in 1780 and never updated because Marcus believed affectation was weakness. The man had been Victor's closest friend for a century before Theodore's execution destroyed that bond. Now they existed in professional hostility, neither willing to force confrontation, but both aware that reconciliation had died with Theodore's ashes. Marcus took his position at the left of the throne's senior counselor by tradition and proximity to power. His expression offered no clue what he thought about the emergency session, but his hand rested near the sword he still carried, despite centuries of relative peace. Old soldiers never truly disarmed. Lady Catherine Morin arrived next, gliding rather than walking in the way old vampires sometimes moved when they forgot to mimic human locomotion. 185 years turned during the French Revolution's height, when Paris ran red and survival meant choosing sides before the guillotine chose for you. Catherine had survived by being smarter than everyone around her, a trait she'd carried into immortality with ruthless efficiency. She wore modern clothing, tailored suit, minimal jewelry-styled hair that suggested professional competence rather than aristocratic pretense. Catherine understood that survival in the 21st century required adaptation, that clinging to Victorian aesthetics marked you as obsolete regardless of actual power. Her nod to Victor carried respect, but not deference. Catherine recognized authority when it served her interests and challenged it when it didn't. The other nobles filtered in over the next 10 minutes. Lord Sebastian Graves, 420 years old, oldest vampire in the court, and possibly the eastern seaboard. The Constantine twins, relatively young at 60 years, but positioned well through their maker's influence. Ambassador Chen, 200 years, and still maintaining diplomatic connections with Asian vampire courts. A dozen others, each representing different factions and interests, all united by the question of what catastrophically stupid decision their king had made this time. When the last noble had taken position, Victor stood. The hall quieted instantly. 3 centuries of rule had taught him that authority stemmed less from title and more from willingness to use violence when challenged. Every vampire in this room knew he'd killed his own mentor, had personally executed 83 vampires over his reign, had survived assassination attempts and political coups, and the slow grinding decline of vampire influence in an increasingly hostile world. They feared him, which was different from respecting him, but served similar purposes. Victor let the silence stretch until discomfort became pressure. Then he spoke, voice carrying to the farthest corners without requiring raised volume. He'd taken a human apprentice, effective immediately. Full covenant protections applied. Any vampire who harmed her would answer to him personally. The hall erupted. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos, first sharp and controlled. This required council approval covenant law was explicit about human apprentices. The risks were documented and substantial. What possible justification could outweigh established protocol? Victor met his former friend's eyes and saw something flicker there. Not surprise, but confirmation, as if Marcus had been expecting exactly this kind of unilateral action and was disappointed to be proven right. The response came flat and factual. The girl possessed rare talent, had independently accessed fourth circle magic without formal training, demonstrated abilities that suggested bloodline compatibility with dimensional sorcery. Refusing to train her would waste unprecedented potential. Lady Catherine's laugh was silk over steel, and what would training her accomplish besides creating a weapon to destroy them all? Victor turned his attention to her. Catherine's expression remained professionally neutral, but her fingers drummed against her forearm in the nervous tell she'd never quite eliminated, despite nearly 2 centuries of practice. The answer required honesty training. Might create a weapon, yes, or it might create the first successful bridge. Since Aldrich Varathane's experiments, someone who could stabilize dimensional rifts rather than simply forcing them closed, someone who could negotiate with Shadeborn rather than fighting them, someone who represented evolution rather than extinction. Or training might create exactly the kind of catastrophe Catherine feared, and they'd all die screaming while dimensional predators poured through rifts the girl couldn't control. Both outcomes were possible, but doing nothing guaranteed failure, guaranteed that when Maya's transformation completed in 6 months, she'd fragment into madness or become an uncontrolled beacon, drawing every Shadeborn on the eastern seaboard. Sebastian spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of 4 centuries had. Victor forgotten the Northern Province disaster, 4,000 humans dead because a 16-year-old bridge lost control. The church had spent a decade rebuilding trust. This decision risked undoing all that progress. Victor hadn't forgotten. He'd studied the Northern Province files extensively before making tonight's decision. The boy had been isolated, untrained, frightened. His foster parents had hidden him from authorities rather than seeking help. When the transformation began accelerating, they'd tried homemade solutions, salt circles, and prayer, and the kind of folk magic that worked on television but accomplished nothing in reality. By the time church authorities discovered him, the boy had already opened 3 permanent rifts. Shadeborn poured through for 6 days before combined vampire and church forces managed to seal the breaches. The casualty count included humans and vampires, both no discrimination in the slaughter. The boy had been executed after the battle, mercy killing officially, murder from certain perspectives. Victor had no intention of replicating those mistakes. Marcus moved closer to the throne, closing the distance until protocol demanded Victor either retreat or establish dominance. The old soldier's face showed nothing but the set of his jaw suggested barely controlled fury. The accusation came quiet enough that only those nearest could hear Victor was gambling with all their lives, 347 years old, and still making the same arrogant choices that had characterized his entire reign, still believing that he alone possessed the wisdom to decide life and death for everyone else. Just like when he'd executed Theodore. The throne room went silent. Nobody mentioned Theodore Blackwood anymore. The execution had been justified under covenant law. The man had slaughtered a human village, 37 dead, including children, and left enough evidence that even sympathetic vampires couldn't argue innocence. But Theodore had been Marcus's brother, and grief didn't care about legal justification. Victor stood slowly, deliberately placing himself at eye level with Marcus. The height difference was negligible. Both men had been tall before transformation, but the gesture carried symbolic weight. The response emerged cold and precise. Theodore's execution had been necessary and lawful. Maya Sterling's apprenticeship was necessary and lawful. If Marcus wanted to challenge either decision, he could invoke formal combat rights, and they could settle this the old way. Marcus's hand moved to his sword hilt. For 3 heartbeats, violence hung in the air between them like static electricity before a lightning strike. Then Marcus stepped back, hand falling away from the weapon. His expression showed nothing, but his eyes carried something that might have been satisfaction. The words came carefully. Measured formal challenge would be premature, but the council required full disclosure. What exactly had Maya Sterling done that warranted such drastic protection? What made her different from the dozens of human magic practitioners the court had dealt with over the past century? Victor detailed the previous night's events in clinical summary. Forbidden magic practice discovered Shadeborn's scout eliminated evidence of hybrid transformation already underway. Book confirmed as Aldrich Verathane's missing grimoire apprenticeship established as containment protocol. Catherine spoke next. Professional curiosity overriding political concerns. If Maya carried Aldrich's book, if the transformation was already advanced, what made Victor confident he could control the outcome? When Aldrich himself had failed with 5 of 6 subjects, the honest answer was that Victor had no such confidence. Training Maya was educated guess rather than certain solution. But the alternative was execution or abandonment, and both options left the book active and searching for its next compatible reader. Better to have the weapon pointed in a direction you could observe than wondering when it would discharge in your blind spot. Catherine nodded slowly expressionally, suggesting she recognized the logic even if she didn't like it. Her next question came softer. Had Elena Sterling been informed that her daughter was transforming into something that might not be named? Victor hadn't spoken to Elena yet. That conversation would happen tonight after the session concluded. The silence that followed carried judgment. Sebastian cleared his throat with the dry rasp of someone who'd stopped breathing regularly decades ago. The council required time to discuss implications, vote on formal approval of the apprenticeship, establish oversight protocols to ensure the girl's training didn't endanger the estate or surrounding territories. Victor shook his head. The apprenticeship was established fact. Council approval would be ceremonial rather than functional. Oversight protocols were negotiable if they didn't interfere with actual training. But Maya Sterling was his responsibility now under his protection and his authority. Anyone who moved against her moved against him. The ultimatum hung in the chamber's stillness. Marcus's voice cut through the tension. Then the council would vote on confidence in Victor's continued leadership. If 2/3 agreed that this decision represented dangerous instability, Covenant law allowed for peaceful transition to an elected council structure. Victor had been expecting this move for months. The threat was real. Marcus commanded enough support to potentially force abdication if he pushed hard enough. But forcing the vote now while emotions ran high and information remained incomplete would fracture the court before any replacement structure could stabilize. The counteroffer emerged calm and reasonable table. The confidence vote for 30 days allowed the court to observe Maya's training and assess her stability, then vote with full information rather than immediate reaction. If at the end of 30 days the council determined she represented unacceptable risk, Victor would personally handle the necessary execution and accept whatever consequences followed. Catherine's expression suggested appreciation for the political maneuvering. Marcus looked less convinced but didn't immediately object. Sebastian called for preliminary vote, all in favor of Victor's proposal. Hands rose slowly, 8 of 15. All opposed 4 hands, 3 abstentions, vampires unwilling to commit either direction until circumstances clarified. The motion passed by simple majority, 30 days until final assessment. Victor reclaimed his throne, noting which nobles had voted, which direction, and filing the information for future reference. Political landscapes shifted constantly. Today's ally became tomorrow's betrayer with depressing regularity. The session concluded with additional business territory, disputes in Baltimore, defeating violations in Boston, treaty negotiations with insurance requiring his formal signature. Routine matters that would have bored him to unconsciousness if he'd retained the ability to sleep. By the time the throne room emptied, midnight had come and gone. Victor remained seated, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 347 years pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Marcus lingered after the others departed. The silence stretched between them, loaded with 2 centuries of shared history and mutual betrayal. Finally, why heard Marcus's voice carried genuine curiosity beneath the anger. Why risk everything for one human girl when there are trained mages who'd accept apprenticeship, vampires who'd kill for access to Aldrich's knowledge? Victor considered lying, offering some pragmatic justification that would make sense in the cold mathematics of survival. Instead, he told the truth because she reminded him of himself at that age, arrogant and curious, and convinced that rules existed for everyone except those special enough to transcend them. Because Aldrich had seen that same quality in Victor 3 centuries ago and offered training despite the risks. Because maybe this time the story could end differently. Marcus absorbed the answer without visible reaction. Then he turned and left footsteps echoing through the empty hall. Victor sat alone in the darkness, wondering if he'd just made the stupidest decision of a very long life, or the first truly wise choice in decades. Probably both. The walk to Elena Sterling's quarters felt longer than it should have. Victor found himself delaying examining tapestries he'd seen 1,000 times, counting pillars he could have drawn from memory, doing anything except delivering news that would reshape a mother's understanding of her daughter's future. Elena answered his knock, wearing a housecoat over practical pajamas, reading glasses perched on her nose, a book in one hand, not Aldrich's grimoire, but something far more mundane, a paperback novel with a dragon on the cover. Her expression shifted from surprise to concern in the time it took to register who stood in her doorway at 1 in the morning. Victor asked if they could speak privately. Elena's sitting room was comfortable rather than elegant, furnished with pieces that prioritize function over aesthetics. Photographs covered available surfaces. Maya at various ages, Elena's parents' informal portrait from decades past. A few images of Elena herself at university, looking impossibly young and full of the kind of optimism that usually didn't survive contact with reality. No photos of Maya's father. Victor noted the absence. Elena offered tea. Victor declined. She poured herself a cup anyway, hand steady, but movements slightly too precise, the kind of control that suggested she already suspected bad news and was bracing for impact. The explanation emerged as clinically as possible. Maya had been practicing forbidden magic for 3 months, had accessed Aldrich. Verithane's missing grimoire was undergoing hybrid transformation that would either stabilize or kill her within 6 months, was now Victor's formal apprentice, with all attendant responsibilities and dangers. Elena's cup never reached her mouth. She set it down with deliberate care, liquid sloshing but not spilling. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then how long have you known Elena's voice carried a strange flatness, shock masquerading as calm? Since last night. Victor provided the timeline discovery, Shadeborn attack apprenticeship established by Dawn. Elena's next question came harder, and you didn't think to consult me before making decisions about my daughter's life. The honest answer was that consultation would have changed nothing. Maya was transforming regardless of anyone's approval. The only variables were whether she'd receive training or die untrained. Parental permission didn't factor into survival equations. But Victor had 3 centuries of practice reading when honesty would cause more damage than carefully deployed fiction. Instead, he should have informed her immediately the oversight was his failure But time was limited, and Maya's aura was drawing dimensional predators. Every hour of delay increased the risk to everyone in the estate. Elena absorbed the apology with the same professional composure she brought to managing household staff. When she spoke again, her voice had regained structure. What are Maya's actual chances of survival? Victor could have softened the numbers, offered false hope that would make the conversation easier. But Elena deserved truth even when truth was ugly. Historically, 5 of 6 hybrid transformations ended in death or madness. The single success, Valera Ashbourne, had disappeared under circumstances that suggested the transformation had continued beyond human parameters. So realistic survival rate was perhaps 20%. With training and proper support, maybe 30%. Those were not good odds by any standard, but they were significantly better than zero. Elena's eyes had gone distant, calculating odds she'd probably already determined from her own research. The woman had studied the Purge Wars extensively. Victor remembered now graduate work in supernatural history, thesis rejected for being too focused on vampire-human cooperation. Had her research covered hybrid transformations? Had she known what fighting Aldrich's book might do to someone incompatible with her? The accusation formed before calculation could stop it. You knew. When you assigned Maya to clean the storage wing, when you had her working those rooms for months, you knew the book was there, and you were using your daughter as bait to find it. Elena's face confirmed the truth before her words could deny it. Victor's hands clenched. Vampire physiology allowed for incredible restraint, but the urge to respond with violence still thrummed beneath his civilized surface. Using your own child as experimental subject crossed lines that even he, with all his compromises and moral flexibility, found unconscionable. Elena's response came quiet and devastating. She hadn't known it would bond to Maya, hadn't expected the transformation to begin so quickly, had thought she'd have time to intervene before anything permanent occurred. The admission hung between them like rotting meat. Had she even considered the possibility that her daughter might die, that using her to locate the book might condemn her? Elena's eyes finally met his, and for the first time since the conversation began, real emotion broke through the professional facade. Of course she'd considered it. She'd spent 17 years considering every possible threat to Maya's survival, and she'd chosen to take the risk anyway because living as a visible servant in a vampire estate was slow death by mediocrity, because her daughter deserved chance at something more than cleaning floors and managing linens until old age claimed her. The book was opportunity, dangerous opportunity, but opportunity nonetheless. Victor wanted to argue to explain why risking your child's life for abstract potential was monstrous, but the words caught in his throat because he'd done similar things over 3 centuries. Sent young vampires into battles they might not survive because the alternative was slow decline into irrelevance. Made calculated sacrifices of individuals to preserve larger communities. Justified terrible choices by pointing to terrible necessities. He'd killed Aldrich to protect the kingdom. Elena had endangered Maya to give her future worth having. The mathematics were different, but the fundamental logic was identical. Victor's anger bled away, leaving only exhaustion. He asked if Elena planned to remain on staff, continue managing the household, while her daughter trained in magic that might kill her. Elena's response was immediate. She'd stay, assist however possible. And if Maya died, Elena would hold Victor personally responsible for failing to prevent an outcome she'd set in motion. Fair enough. The conversation concluded with logistics. Maya would move to the observatory tower for safety and convenience. Elena would maintain her current quarters and duties. Twice daily check-ins would be scheduled, assuming training didn't make that impossible. Victor left Elena's sitting room feeling older than his 347 years. The photographs on her walls had watched their entire exchange, frozen moments of Maya's childhood, judging the decisions adults made in the name of protection. Dawn was approaching again. His second sunrise in 48 hours, which meant he'd been awake and active through daylight weakness. The accumulated strain was beginning to show. Reaction times, fractionally slower senses, slightly dulled the specific exhaustion that came from pushing vampire physiology beyond its preferred parameters. He needed to feed soon. Blood bags from the estate's medical supply were sufficient for basic survival, but couldn't match the vitality of fresh blood taken from a living donor. Not that he indulged in that particular pleasure often anymore. Modern ethics and ancient instincts existed in constant tension. The observatory was dark when he arrived, lit only by starlight through the glass dome. Maya sat on the floor beside Aldrich's book, knees drawn to her chest, staring at nothing. Her face showed a particular heaviness that came after too many revelations in too short a time. Victor announced his presence rather than startling her. She looked up but didn't speak. He sat down across from her, positioned deliberately casual, trying to bridge the gap between ancient authority and teenage fear. The conversation they needed to have required vulnerability neither of them particularly enjoyed displaying. First question, did she hate her mother for using her? Maya's response came slowly, as if she was working through the answer even as she spoke it. Hate was too simple. She understood why her mother had done it, understood the desperation of wanting something better than predetermined life. But understanding didn't mean forgiveness came easily. Victor nodded. Wisdom beyond her years, or perhaps just the accelerated maturity that came from confronting mortality early. Second question, did she understand what training would require of her? The discipline, the danger, the possibility that she'd transform into something that couldn't sustain human consciousness? Maya met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd found her in the kitchen, her expression showed something other than fear. Determination maybe, or simply the stubborn refusal to die quietly. She understood. She'd accepted it when she chose apprenticeship over execution. Good. Victor stood, joints protesting slightly from the extended crouch. Age made itself known in small ways, even for vampires. Not weakness exactly, but accumulated fatigue that rest couldn't fully eliminate. Training would begin tomorrow evening. She'd spend today reading theory from books he'd provide, familiarizing herself with principles Aldrich's grimoire assumed she already knew. Tonight they'd work on suppressing her aura, making her presence less obvious to dimensional predators who'd already marked her location. In 30 days, the vampire court would vote on whether to allow her to continue existing. No pressure. Maya's laugh came surprised and slightly hysterical. The sound was human and young and entirely inadequate for their situation, which made it perfect. Victor left her with the books and retreated to his quarters as dawn broke over the Atlantic. The sun had never been his friend, but he'd made accommodation with it over the centuries. Blackout curtains turned his bedroom into artificial night. He lay down without undressing, staring at the ceiling, replaying the past 24 hours, and wondering which of his many decisions would prove catastrophic. Sleep wouldn't come. Vampires didn't sleep in the traditional sense, just entered periods of reduced consciousness that approximated rest. But his mind refused even that minor respite, spinning through calculations and contingencies in the 100 ways everything could collapse. James Harford's voice echoed in memory. Sometimes you can't plan your way to victory. Victor, sometimes you just have to make the call and live with whatever comes after. James was dying, cancer spreading through his brain like wildfire, 3 months until the end, if the doctor's estimates held. Victor had offered transformation. Vampire blood could cure almost anything, rewrite biology from the cellular level up. James had refused. Said he'd lived his time, wanted to die human, didn't want immortality, if it meant losing the things that made him who he was. Victor hadn't understood the choice then, still didn't entirely. But lying in artificial darkness, waiting for the sun to complete its arc so he could resume activity, he wondered if James had wisdom he'd never managed to achieve. Maybe holding on too long was its own kind of death. Maybe knowing when to let go was the real secret to living well. His phone buzzed, text message from an unknown number.
We cannot afford division.
The message
now.
was brief. Colonel James Hartford had collapsed at his home ambulance en route to Portland Medical Center, prognosis unclear, but probably terminal. Victor stared at the words until they blurred. Then he rose, pulled on fresh clothes, and prepared to watch another friend die while the sun burned overhead and made him weak enough that hurrying would accomplish nothing except demonstrating how little control he actually possessed. 347 years. Still learning that some battles couldn't be won through force or strategy or sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Some battles you just lost. The hospital smell hit Victor before he cleared the parking structure, antiseptic over decay. Industrial cleaning solutions failing to mask the copper, sweet scent of blood and dying tissue. Portland Medical Center sprawled across 6 acres of urban landscape, a concrete monument to humanity's endless war against mortality. The war they always lost eventually. Sunlight burned through his jacket sleeves despite the fabric's UV-resistant weave. 4 in the afternoon meant full solar exposure weakness, spreading through his limbs like cold water through veins. Victor moved carefully, precisely, each step calibrated to avoid the stumble that would mark him as other. Humans noticed inconsistency more than they noticed obvious differences. The ICU occupied the 7th floor. Victor bypassed the elevators, enclosed spaces with fluorescent lighting, made his skin crawl, and took the stairwell despite the additional exposure to windows at each landing. By the time he reached James's floor, his hands were shaking minutely, and his vision had acquired a particular graininess that came from pushing vampire physiology through daylight hours. James Hartford lay in a private room, machines clustered around the bed like mechanical mourners. The retired colonel looked smaller than Victor remembered, as if the cancer was consuming him from within and leaving only the structural outline of who he'd been. Gray skin, sunken eyes, breathing that came in shallow pulls through oxygen tubes. A woman sat beside the bed, James's daughter Rebecca, 43, a prosecutor in the district attorney's office. She'd inherited her father's tactical mind and his refusal to accept defeat gracefully. Her eyes, when they met Victor's, carried accusation. You could save him, and you won't. The words came rougher than intended. James had made his choice, deserved to die on his own terms. And vampire transformation wasn't salvation, regardless of how it appeared from the outside. Rebecca's expression suggested she'd heard similar justifications before and found them wanting. She stood, kissed her father's forehead with the particular gentleness of someone rationing final gestures, and left without speaking further. Victor took her vacated chair. The plastic creaked under his weight. James's eyes opened slowly, focusing with visible effort. His voice emerged as gravel over broken glass. You look like hell, Victor. The observation carried dark humor. Victor responded in kind. At least he wasn't actively dying. James's laugh turned into a cough that rattled fluid in damaged lungs. When he recovered enough to speak, his words came slower. Careful, the doctors gave him 48 hours, maybe less. Brain tumors were spreading faster than anticipated, but he'd held on this long because he needed to say things while his mind still worked well enough to form coherent thoughts. Victor leaned forward, elbows on knees, closing the distance without crowding. 30 years of friendship had taught him how to read James's unspoken needs. The dying man's gaze moved to the window, tracking clouds across afternoon sky. Had Victor gone through with the apprenticeship? Was Maya Sterling officially under his protection now? The confirmation brought something like satisfaction to James's expression. His next words emerged deliberately, each one chosen with the precision of someone aware that language was becoming limited resource good. The girl had potential. Victor needed to stop wasting it by second-guessing every decision. 300 years should have taught him that perfect choices didn't exist, and waiting for certainty meant never acting at all. Victor absorbed the criticism without deflecting. James had earned the right to speak, bluntly earned it through decades of tactical advice that had kept Victor's brain stable when political pressures should have shattered. The question that had been building since he'd received the text message finally emerged. Why refuse transformation? Why choose death when immortality was available? When they could have centuries together instead of this truncated ending? James's eyes returned to Victor's face, and the clarity in them was briefly devastating, because he'd lived enough, seen enough, done enough that continuing would be repetition rather than growth. He'd raised 2 daughters, served his country through 3 wars, built relationships that mattered. Adding centuries to that would dilute it rather than enhance it. Besides, and here James's voice dropped to something rawer, he'd watched Victor carry 347 years of mistakes and regrets. Watched him struggle under the weight of immortality's accumulated guilt. James loved his friend enough to not want that burden for himself.
You know the stakes.
The words landed with physical impact. Victor sat back in the chair, processing implications he'd never considered. Immortality as curse rather than gift. Existence as weight rather than opportunity. 3 centuries of survival reframed as 3 centuries of accumulating debris. James continued, the voice weakening. But message clear, Victor needed to learn what James had understood for years now. Legacy wasn't about how long you lived, but what you built with whatever time you had. The girl Maya, she was Victor's chance to build something that outlasted him. Train her well, give her tools. James suspected Victor had never given himself permission to make mistakes. Framework to learn from them, understanding that failure wasn't tragedy, but simply information. And most critically, teach her when to let go. When to pass responsibility to the next generation instead of clinging to power until death pried it from cold fingers. Victor's throat tightened with the particular ache that preceded tears he could no longer produce. Vampire transformation eliminated crying along with most other involuntary biological responses, but the emotional mechanism remained phantom sensation where function used to be. The promise emerged quietly. He'd teach Maya everything James wanted, would try to be better than he'd been for the past 3 centuries, would attempt to build legacy worth remembering instead of simply extending reign worth forgetting. James smiled, and for a moment the dying man's face showed echoes of the 25-year-old soldier Victor had saved in Vietnam, satisfied at peace, ready for whatever came next. They sat in silence as afternoon stretched toward evening. Machines beeped steadily, marking heartbeats that were slowing breaths that came with increasing difficulty. Rebecca returned with coffee she didn't drink, sitting on her father's other side, creating Death Watch Triangle. James slipped into unconsciousness around 7. The doctor, young woman with exhaustion written in every line, explained that brain function was deteriorating rapidly. He likely wouldn't wake again, but hearing remained active until the end if they wanted to say goodbyes. Rebecca spoke first, words tumbling out in desperate cascade: childhood memories, appreciation for lessons learned, apologies for arguments and distances, and all the small failures that accumulate between parents and children over decades. Her voice broke repeatedly, but she pushed through, determined to say everything while the possibility of being heard remained. When she finished, she looked at Victor with something between resentment and understanding. Your turn. Victor had 30 years of friendship to summarize 3 decades of shared strategy and bitter arguments in the particular intimacy of 2 soldiers who'd seen each other's worst moments and chosen continued association anyway. The words came simpler than expected. Thank you for the truth when others offered flattery. Thank you for the honesty when comfort would have been easier. Thank you for being human enough to show him what he'd lost, in vampire enough to accept what he'd become. James's vitals stuttered. The machine's steady rhythm became irregular, then stopped entirely. Rebecca made a sound between sob and scream. Victor remained motionless, watching his last human friend die the way countless others had died before him. Final exhale muscles, releasing tension, the specific stillness that marked the boundary between life and whatever came after. The time of death was logged as 1947. James Hartford, 68 years old, retired colonel, father of 2 friends to 1 very old vampire. The summation felt inadequate for a life that had contained multitudes. Rebecca handled arrangements with military precision. Her father had planned everything years ago, typical James efficiency. Burial would be at Arlington National Cemetery, full honor service scheduled for the following week. She asked if Victor would attend. The funeral would occur during daylight. Even with UV protection and careful planning, prolonged sun exposure in an open cemetery would weaken him to the point of near helplessness. Tactically inadvisable, potentially dangerous. The answer came immediately: he'd be there regardless. Rebecca nodded once, acceptance without warmth. Then she left to begin the cascade of notifications that followed death siblings and distant relatives and military contacts who needed to know that another veteran had reached the end of this particular war. Victor remained in the hospital room longer than strictly necessary, sitting beside a body that no longer contained the person he'd known. The machines had been silenced. The room felt smaller without their electronic chorus. Eventually, an orderly arrived to begin post-death procedures. Victor left, walking back through corridors that smelled of ending and false hope, emerging into Portland night that had finally released him from solar weakness. The drive back to Ashford Estate passed in detached observation traffic lights, other vehicles, pedestrians moving through evening routines. The world continued despite James Hartford's absence. Always did. Victor had attended enough funerals over 3 centuries to know that the universe remained aggressively indifferent to individual loss. Maya was waiting in the observatory when he arrived, surrounded by theory texts and looking overwhelmed. She looked up as he entered, question forming, then stopped as she registered his expression. Her voice came carefully neutral. Something happened. Victor confirmed that a friend had died, said nothing further. Maya possessed enough social intelligence to recognize when pressing for details would accomplish nothing useful. Instead, she returned to her text, giving him space to process grief in whatever form it took for 300-year-old vampires. The gesture showed more maturity than most adults managed. Victor spent the next hour reviewing training schedules and suppression techniques, forcing his attention into practical channels, because dwelling on James's death would serve no purpose beyond indulgent melancholy. Work provided structure when emotional landscape became treacherous. Around midnight, Marcus Blackwood arrived unannounced. The older vampire stood in the observatory doorway, formal evening attire suggesting he'd come directly from some social function. There would be an emergency court session tomorrow evening. Formal challenge had been issued, trial by combat, to determine whether Victor's judgment remained sound enough to continue ruling. Maya looked between them, confusion evident. Victor felt only weary inevitability. Marcus was forcing the confrontation now, while Victor was emotionally compromised and physically exhausted, because tactical advantage mattered more than courtesy. The question emerged flat: was Marcus the challenger? The confirmation came with something that might have been regret. Yes, by ancient right and covenant law. Marcus Blackwood formally challenged Victor Ashford's fitness to rule combat to first blood. Winner's judgment would stand regarding the apprentice and all related decisions. Maya started to protest. Victor raised one hand, silencing her. The challenge was legal and appropriate. Marcus had every right to demand proof that his king wasn't making catastrophically poor decisions based on sentiment rather than strategy. Tomorrow evening, then, traditional weapons and protocols, witnesses from both the vampire court and church authorities to ensure legitimacy. Marcus nodded once, turned to leave, then paused for what it's worth. "I'm sorry about Hartford. He was a good man." The door closed before Victor could respond. Maya's voice came small and frightened. "Can you win?" The honest answer was uncertain. Marcus was 77 years younger, which translated to faster reflexes and less accumulated damage. But Victor had 3 centuries of combat experience, tactical knowledge that only came from surviving dozens of real battles rather than training exercises. The fight would depend on whether wisdom could overcome vigor, whether calculation could defeat intensity. Victor told Maya something simpler: he'd win because losing meant her death, and he'd made a promise to James Hartford's ghost that he'd train her properly. Sometimes the best motivation was spite directed at the universe's indifference. The next evening arrived with brutal swiftness. Victor spent the day in meditation and preparation, sharpening blades, reviewing Marcus's known fighting style, consuming blood from the estate's stores to ensure optimal physical capacity. The feeding was mechanical, necessary, devoid of pleasure. Animal blood tasted of survival rather than vitality, but it would serve. By dusk, the estate's main courtyard had been transformed into formal combat arena. Torches burned in iron sconces despite available electric lighting. Tradition demanded, fire demanded, the aesthetic of trials that predated modern convenience. The vampire court assembled along 3 sides, leaving the 4th open for church observers. Commander Sarah Kane stood with 2 other church officials, watching preparations with professional detachment. Her presence guaranteed the trial's legitimacy in human eyes, ensured that whatever occurred would be recognized under supernatural covenant law. Marcus arrived dressed for battle leather armor that managed to look both historical and functional longsword that had probably seen actual combat during his mortal military service. His expression showed nothing controlled and empty. The way soldiers appeared before killing became necessary. Victor wore simpler clothing, black tactical gear that prioritized mobility over protection. His blade was shorter, designed for close quarters work rather than formal dueling. Different philosophies encoded the weapon choice. Marcus believed in overwhelming force and maintaining distance. Victor preferred getting inside an opponent's guard and making the fight intimate. Lady Catherine served as arbiter, explaining rules both combatants already knew. Fight to first blood, blood drawn from torso or above, no magic or supernatural abilities, beyond baseline vampire physiology. Yield acknowledged immediately upon declaration. Victor's judgment on the apprentice matter would stand without further contest. Simple rules for a simple question. Who deserved to lead? The combat began with traditional formality, raised blades, recognition of opponent 3 steps back. Then Marcus attacked. The first exchange happened faster than human eyes could track, slash and parry, and riposte steel, screaming against steel, in patterns that would look choreographed if they weren't entirely improvised. Marcus fought with textbook precision, each move flowing into the next with military discipline. Victor countered with veterans economy, wasting no motion, reading 3 moves ahead from subtle weight shifts and micro adjustments in grip. They separated after the initial flurry, both unbloodied, circling to assess. Marcus's voice carried across the space between them. "You're slower than I remember." The observation was accurate. Victor responded with equal honesty, "And you're more predictable than you realize." The second exchange came from Marcus's initiative lunge, designed to force Victor backward, follow-up/aimed at creating distance. Victor recognized the pattern from their training sessions a century ago, when they'd still been friends and teaching each other had seemed valuable. Instead of retreating, Victor stepped inside Marcus's reach, too close for the longer blade to achieve proper leverage. His own weapon moved in tight arc, drawing a thin line across Marcus's left shoulder, not deep enough to qualify as winning strike, but enough to prove the point about predictability. Marcus disengaged, reassessing. Blood welled from the shallow cut, already beginning to heal through vampire regeneration. His expression shifted into something harder, tactical calculation giving way to focused intensity. The third exchange was different. Marcus abandoned textbook technique in favor of raw aggression, trading precision for pressure. The shift nearly worked, forcing Victor fully defensive blade work, reducing to pure parrying, as strikes came faster than conscious thought could track. But aggression created patterns of its own. After 20 exchanges, Victor identified the rhythm, high-low-high, always the same sequence buried underneath variation. He waited for the pattern to repeat, then broke at blade, sliding past Marcus's guard to score a line across his ribs, deeper than the shoulder cut, closer to qualifying damage. But still not enough to end the fight. They separated again, both breathing harder now. Vampire physiology didn't require oxygen for cellular function, but exertion created familiar responses. Muscle memory from mortal lives asserting itself despite biological changes. Marcus's next words came quieter, men, only for Victor. "This isn't going how you think it is." Before Victor could process the statement, Marcus lunged again, but this time the attack was wrong, telegraphed too obviously, creating an opening that shouldn't exist. Victor's instincts screamed trap even as his body moved to exploit the vulnerability, blade driving toward Marcus's exposed torso. The opening isn't trap, it was gift. Victor's blade scored Marcus's chest, cutting through leather armor to draw blood in a line that ran from collarbone to sternum. First blood, legitimate strike. Victory under trial rules. Marcus stepped back immediately, raising his blade in formal surrender. The challenge is withdrawn. Victor Ashford's judgment stands. The apprentice remains under his protection and authority. The courtyard erupted into confused murmurs. Catherine looked between them, clearly recognizing something had occurred beyond the surface fight, but uncertain what precisely had transpired. Victor understood Marcus had thrown the fight, deliberately created the opening that allowed Victor to win, engineered the outcome while maintaining plausible deniability. The entire combat had been theater designed to achieve specific political result. But why challenge at all if the intention was to lose? The answer crystallized as Victor noticed Sarah Kane's expression. She'd expected this outcome, had positioned herself to observe not who won, but how the victory occurred. This had been coordination, multi-party planning that Victor hadn't been included in. Marcus stepped closer under pretense of formal reconciliation, voice dropping to whisper, "That wouldn't carry beyond vampire hearing. We need to talk privately tonight. Bring the girl and trust that I'm helping, even if you don't understand how yet." Then louder for the assembled court, "The king's wisdom stands proven. The apprentice will be trained under proper oversight, and those who question his judgment stand corrected." Political rhetoric, but effective. The murmuring shifted from confusion toward acceptance. Victor had won combat, therefore Victor's decisions were validated. Simple logic that ignored the complexity underneath. Catherine formally declared the trial concluded. Victor's authority reaffirmed all previous motions regarding confidence. Votes rendered moot by combat outcome. The court began dispersing, nobles returning to their various territories and interests. Sarah Kane approached as the crowd thinned. She needed to speak with Victor about church matters, preferably somewhere private, where they wouldn't be observed or overheard by parties who might misinterpret diplomatic discussion as conspiracy. The evening was rapidly becoming more complicated than Victor had capacity to handle after the past 48 hours. But curiosity overrode exhaustion. What exactly was Sarah Kane playing at? And why was Marcus involved? They convened in Victor's private study an hour later. Victor, Marcus, Sarah Kane, and Maya. The girl looked overwhelmed by being included in what was obviously high-level political maneuvering, but she'd proven capable of keeping silent and absorbing information even when confused. General William Cross entered last, surprising everyone except Sarah. The retired Marine Corps officer closed the door with deliberate care and engaged the study's privacy ward's magical and electronic countermeasures that made eavesdropping functionally impossible. Cross spoke first, voice carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to strategic briefings. They had 48 hours before church leadership arrived to conduct formal inspection of Maya Sterling's training, after which decisions would be made regarding the bridge program's continuation or termination. Sarah interrupted, except the bridge program, as currently structured, was designed to fail, specifically designed to create weapons rather than diplomats. And she'd spent the past 3 years collecting evidence of systematic abuse within church command structure. Victor absorbed this revelation with growing unease. Was Sarah suggesting the Northern Province disaster had been manufactured? Her confirmation came grim and detailed. The 16-year-old boy hadn't lost control. Accidentally, he'd been deliberately pushed beyond his limits by handlers who wanted to prove bridges were too dangerous to allow civilian oversight, wanted to justify military control over all-dimensional magic research. The boy had tried to stop, tried to explain that the rifts were becoming unstable, tried to get help. His handlers had threatened his foster family if he didn't continue pushing through pain and psychological fracturing. When he'd finally broken, when the rifts tore open and Shadeborn poured through, the handlers had vanished, left him alone to face consequences of their manipulation. Then executed him and blamed the entire catastrophe on bridge instability rather than handler negligence. 4,000 deaths as cover-up for institutional failure. Maya made a small sound of horror. Marcus's expression had gone dangerously empty. Victor felt cold spreading through his chest. If Sarah's information was accurate, if the church had deliberately engineered the Northern Province disaster, then every political decision for the past decade had been based on manufactured crisis. Cross confirmed Sarah's account. He'd been part of the investigation team's seen evidence that didn't make it into official reports, watched as his superiors suppressed testimony that contradicted the approved narrative. He'd kept silent for 10 years, career military man following orders, until Sarah had approached him with documentation and asked if he could live with himself knowing the truth stayed buried. The answer had been no. Cross had been collecting additional evidence ever since building case that might survive scrutiny if they could ever find the right moment and right venue to present it. That moment was now. Maya Sterling's apprenticeship provided opportunity. Train her properly, demonstrate that bridges could achieve stable integration with correct support, use her success to challenge the institutional narrative that bridges were inherently uncontrollable. Victor leaned back in his chair, processing implications Sarah and Cross were proposing, using Maya as political weapon against their own organization, vindication of approaches that had been systematically suppressed, proof that church leadership had been wrong deliberately rather than accidentally. The risk was extraordinary. If Maya failed, if her transformation became unstable despite proper training, it would validate everything the church had claimed and eliminate any chance of reform. Marcus finally spoke, voice carrying weight of military experience, which is why the combat trial was necessary. Why Victor needed public validation of his judgment before committing to this course. Why they needed documented proof that vampire leadership supported the new approach. The entire trial had been theater designed to position Victor as having won the right to continue the apprentice program over internal resistance. Now, when church leadership arrived, they'd find united vampire court backing his decisions rather than fractured opposition they could exploit. Political manipulation at its most complex, manufacture crisis, resolve crisis, publicly use resolution as leverage for actual objectives. Victor should have felt angry about being manipulated. Instead, he felt something closer to relief. He wasn't facing this alone, wasn't required to solve impossible problems through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. James Harford's voice echoed in memory. Sometimes the best strategy is letting other people help you. Victor, try it sometime. The question emerged practical rather than emotional. What did they need from him specifically? Sarah's answer came prepared. Train Maya properly, document everything, demonstrate measurable progress in aura suppression and dimensional sensitivity, and most critically establish communication protocols with Shadeborn, if possible, rather than simply eliminating them on site. The last requirement raised immediate concerns. Shadeborn were dimensional predators, entities that existed to consume energy from living beings. Attempting negotiation was like attempting diplomacy with hurricanes. Maya spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Unless they weren't predators at all, unless desperation made them act like predators, when they were actually something else, something capable of reason, if approached correctly. The observation hung in the study's silence, radical and dangerous and potentially revolutionary. Cross nodded slowly, exactly the kind of thinking that got suppressed under current church leadership, exactly the kind of innovation that could prevent future disasters if given proper support and resources. Victor looked at Maya, really looked at her, seeing past the frightened teenager to whatever she might become with training and time. James Hartford had been right. She represented opportunity, chance to build something that outlasted accumulated regrets. The decision emerged clearly. They'd proceed with Sarah and Cross's plan document. Everything demonstrate that bridges could succeed where previous subjects had failed, and use Maya's transformation as catalyst for institutional reform. If she survived, that remained the critical variable. Marcus stood stretching muscles that had been tense through the entire meeting. He'd arranged for additional security, make sure no vampire factions decided to preempt church decisions by eliminating Maya themselves, and provide political cover if Victor's judgment was questioned again. The gesture of support from his former friend carried more weight than any formal alliance treaty. Sarah and Cross left together, disappearing into Portland night to continue their evidence gathering and preparation for the coming inspection. Marcus lingered briefly, expression showing something that might have been apology or might have been understanding. He'd spent 200 years hating Victor for Theodore's execution, and it had accomplished nothing except making both of them miserable. Time to try something different. Time to see if old soldiers could remember how to be friends instead of enemies. The words came quietly, honestly. Theodore's execution had been necessary and lawful, but it had still hurt, and Marcus should have said that 2 centuries ago, instead of letting resentment metastasize into permanent hostility. Marcus accepted the acknowledgement with a nod that carried its own weight of unspoken apology. Then he too left, returning to whatever preparations occupied his time now that open conflict between them had been resolved. Victor and Maya sat alone in the study's silence, stretching until she finally spoke. That was a lot of politics, more than she'd expected. Everything was more complicated than simple apprenticeship implied. Victor's response came dry, welcome to 3 centuries of leadership where simple decisions didn't exist and every choice created cascading consequences that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Maya absorbed this with visible discomfort. Then she asked the question that had probably been building since the trial: could Victor actually teach her what she needed to know? Or was he making promises that ability couldn't support? The honest answer was uncertain. He'd never trained a bridge, never worked with dimensional magic at the level Aldrich's grimoire demanded. He'd be learning alongside her, improvising solutions to problems that might not have solutions. But James Hartford had taught him that uncertainty wasn't disqualification. Sometimes you move forward despite inadequate knowledge because standing still guaranteed failure. They'd figure it out together, or they'd fail together. Either way, the attempt mattered more than the outcome. Maya's expression suggested she found this philosophy less than completely reassuring, but she nodded anyway, accepting limitations honestly presented. The night was old and getting older. Dawn would arrive in 4 hours. Victor needed to feed again. The combat trial had depleted reserves despite the fight's brevity. Maya needed rest that humans required, and vampires didn't. Cellular repair processes that would become increasingly important as her transformation progressed. Tomorrow would bring new complications: church inspections and political maneuvering, and the constant pressure of training someone who might not survive, regardless of effort invested. But tonight, Victor allowed himself to acknowledge the small victory. He wasn't alone anymore. Sarah and Cross and even Marcus were working toward the same goal, trying to reform systems that had calcified into dysfunction. James Hartford would have approved, would have said that building alliances was the first step toward building legacy worth remembering. Victor hoped his friend had been right, hoped that the promise made in a hospital room while machines beat their futile measurements would prove achievable. Hoped that 347 years of mistakes might finally yield to something better. The study's windows showed pre-dawn gray bleeding across Portland's skyline. Another day survived, another night of preparation for battles yet to come. Victor closed his eyes and let exhaustion take him, trusting that sunrise would arrive, whether he welcomed it or not, trusting that the world would continue its indifferent rotation, trusting that somehow, despite everything, they might actually succeed in building something that outlasted them all. 3 months passed in compressed urgency. Maya's training consumed every evening hour. Aura suppression techniques that left her trembling with exhaustion, dimensional sensitivity exercises that made her nose bleed from the mental strain, combat applications that Victor insisted she master, despite her protests that diplomacy shouldn't require knowing how to kill efficiently. The church inspection had come and gone with surprising smoothness. Sarah Kane's documentation and Victor's meticulous training logs had satisfied even the most skeptical observers. Maya's transformation had stabilized rather than accelerated the runes on her arms, achieving fixed patterns that no longer shifted or spread. She'd become something unprecedented, a hybrid who maintained human consciousness while accessing dimensional magic. The success had bought them aim and credibility both. Now they faced the test that would determine whether theory could survive contact with reality. Portland Harbor stretched dark and vast under October moon, the same waterfront where Victor had executed Aldrich Varathane 2 centuries ago. Tonight, the location would serve different purpose. First, major dimensional evacuation in recorded history. 40,000 shade-born refugees crossing from their dying realm into the between spaces, a dimensional buffer zone that existed partially in both realities and fully in neither. 12 stabilized rifts hummed across the harbor, purple silver light, casting strange shadows on water and concrete. Each rift required constant maintenance from trained mages, 6 church specialists, 4 vampire practitioners, and Maya herself coordinating the entire operation through connections only she could perceive. Victor stood apart from the main activity, watching with the detached observation that came from too many military operations. His role tonight was security rather than execution, making certain no hostile forces interrupted the evacuation. Marcus occupied similar position on the operation's opposite flank, both of them aware that perfect targets existed for anyone who wanted to sabotage vampire-human shade-born cooperation. The first refugees began crossing around midnight. They emerged cautious and afraid forms flickering between solid and shadow as they adapted to the between spaces' different dimensional frequency. Maya spoke to them in language Victor still couldn't comprehend. Not old vampiric, but something deeper, the dimensional tongue that existed in concepts rather than words. Her voice carried reassurance that transcended translation. Safe passage, no tricks, cooperation rather than conquest. The Shadeborn responded with what might have been gratitude or might have been relief. Difficult to read emotional states in beings whose faces consisted of crystalline teeth and flat reflective eyes. General Cross moved through the operation with military efficiency, coordinating church personnel and maintaining secure perimeter. Sarah Kane worked alongside Maya, learning the diplomatic protocols that might define future operations if tonight succeeded. 2 hours into the evacuation, the explosion started. Victor registered the first detonation a fraction second before the sound reached conscious awareness, vampire hearing detecting the specific frequency of igniting plastic explosive. His body moved before thought finished forming speed, carrying him toward the blast site on the harbor's eastern edge. 3 rift generators had been destroyed, their magical matrices collapsing as physical components scattered across concrete. The rifts they'd been maintaining snapped closed with violence that sent shockwaves rippling through nearby dimensions. Shadeborn caught mid-crossing, simply ceased existing, torn apart by competing dimensional pulls. Sunchurch extremists emerged from concealment positions, weapons raised, and religious fury written across faces that believed they were preventing apocalypse rather than causing it. 15 humans against vampire speed and supernatural strength should have been an absurd mismatch. But they'd armed themselves with silver tornias and UV flashbangs, weapons specifically designed to kill or incapacitate creatures like Victor. The firefight erupted in chaos, punctuated by screaming human voices, demanding the abominations be destroyed. Shadeborn shrieks as panicked refugees fled back through remaining rifts, church personnel shouting orders that went unheard in the confusion. Victor moved through the extremists like scythe through weak, disarming, rather than killing when possible, because corpses would complicate the political aftermath. His dagger found weapons rather than throats, hands rather than hearts targeted to neutralize without creating martyrs. But even 3 centuries of combat experience couldn't account for every variable. One extremist fired wildly as Victor disarmed him, the shot going wide of its intended target and finding different flesh entirely. The silver bullet caught Victor in the left shoulder, burning through jacket and skin and muscle, with the specific agony that came from blessed metal reacting with vampire tissue. His arm went instantly numb, reflexes that had functioned flawlessly for 300 years, simply stopping as the silver poisoning spread. He dropped muscle memory from mortal military service, taking over when injured. Minimize target profile, assess damage, determine if continued combat was viable. The assessment came quickly. Silver poisoning would spread through his system for the next 6 hours unless the bullet was removed and the wound burned clean. Combat capability reduced approximately 40%. Mobility compromised, but not eliminated. Marcus reached him first, having crossed the harbor distance in seconds after the shooting started. The older vampire's face showed controlled fury as he provided covering fire with a sidearm that looked anachronistic, but functioned perfectly. Sometimes old weapons serve better than modern alternatives. Maya appeared next, ignoring the tactical stupidity of placing herself in an active combat. Her hands went immediately to Victor's shoulder fingers, searching for the bullet's entry point. She could extract it if he'd let her, had learned enough dimensional manipulation to phase matter through matter without additional tissue damage. Victor started to refuse, too dangerous, too much risk of magical backlash in her current state. But General Cross was already issuing orders to contain the extremists, and the evacuation was collapsing into disorder as Shadeborn panicked, and church personnel struggled to maintain the remaining rifts. They needed him functional or they needed him gone. Sitting wounded in the middle of a tactical disaster served no purpose except demonstrating weakness. The permission came terse, do it quickly. Maya's hands glowed purple-silver as she reached into his shoulder, consciousness extending through flesh and bone in ways that shouldn't be possible under terrestrial physics. The sensation was violation and relief combined, foreign presence in his body, extracting poison metal that his own biology couldn't expel. The bullet emerged in 3 seconds that felt substantially longer. Maya dropped it onto concrete, where it continued smoking faintly, blessed silver reacting with ambient magic. Victor's arm remained numb, but the spreading paralysis stopped. Vampire regeneration would handle the rest of accelerated healing, closing the wound over the next hour. He stood with Marcus's assistants, surveying the damage. 3 rifts destroyed, estimated 30 Shadeborn. Killed in the closures, all 15 extremists neutralized through various combinations of disarming and unconsciousness. But the operation itself was failing. The remaining 9 rifts couldn't handle the refugee volume, and the Shadeborn were retreating in fear rather than continuing the evacuation. 40,000 souls needing transit, and they'd managed perhaps 5,000 before the attack disrupted everything. Maya stared at the chaos with expression that cycled through horror and determination. Then she turned across. She could stabilize the failed rifts, rebuild their matrices using dimensional manipulation rather than mechanical generators. But it would require pushing her abilities beyond anything she'd attempted during training. The risk assessment came from Sarah. Pushing too hard could accelerate Maya's transformation, potentially trigger the cascading failure they'd spent 3 months preventing. Maya's response was simple. What was the alternative? Let 35,000 refugees die because she was afraid of personal consequences. Victor wanted to refuse, wanted to order her to stop, wanted to protect his apprentice from the kind of sacrifice that left permanent scars. But James Harper's voice whispered in Memory Legacy isn't built by playing safe. It's built by people willing to risk everything for something larger than themselves. The decision was Maya's to make, not his. She moved toward the destroyed rift sites before he could speak, hands already glowing with purple fire as she began reconstructing dimensional architecture from memory and instinct. The magic responded to her direction, raw power shaped by will into functional structures. The first rift reopened in 2 minutes, ragged and unstable, but operational. Maya didn't stop, didn't pause, pushing immediately into the second reconstruction. Sweat poured down her face despite October cold, and the runes on her arms blazed bright enough to be visible through her jacket sleeves. Marcus positioned himself as her guard, preventing anyone from interrupting the work. Victor did the same from opposite angle, creating protective triangle around their most valuable asset. The second rift stabilized, then the third. Maya swayed but caught herself breathing ragged and eyes showing the first signs of dimensional bleed pupils reflecting light in ways that suggested she was seeing more than terrestrial reality offered. But the evacuation resumed. Shadeborn began crossing again cautiously at first, and then with increasing speed as they recognized that the operation would continue despite attack. By dawn, 38,000 had completed transit, close enough to the target number that Sarah declared success despite the complications. Maya collapsed the moment the final rift closed consciousness, simply switching off like extinguished light. Victor caught her before she hit concrete, cradling her with the particular care of someone aware that the burden they carried was both precious and fragile. Her pulse ran rapid and thready. The runes on her arms had changed again, deeper now, more intricate, spreading slightly past where they'd been before the operation. Evidence that she'd pushed beyond safe limits, that tonight's success had cost more than they'd fully calculated. But she was breathing. The transformation remained stable. And 40,000 refugees had survived because she'd been willing to risk personal collapse for collective salvation. As Victor carried her toward the waiting vehicle that would return them to the estate Nixie's Thera manifested, the Shadeborn Queen emerged from the final rift seconds before it closed completely, forma solidifying into something that approximated female humanoid, while remaining fundamentally other. 9 feet tall body composed of living shadow and crystalline light face, both beautiful and terrifying, in ways that made terrestrial aesthetics seem magical. Thousands of eyes opened across her skin, jewel-like, where each one focusing independently on different elements of the scene before coordinating into unified perception. Her voice emerged as chorus rather than individual speech, multiple tones harmonizing into words that rattled Victor's bones despite his supernatural durability. "Old King, you surprised us. We expected warrior but found diplomat. Perhaps change is possible even for ancient ones." Victor met her gaze, all 1,000 of them, without flinching. 3 centuries had taught him that showing fear to apex predators only encouraged aggression. His response came level and direct. The surprise had been mutual. His people had expected invasion and found refugees. Instead, cooperation was occurring because all parties recognized survival required it. Nyx Thera's laugh sounded like wind chimes screaming in a void. "Don't mistake temporary alliance for permanent peace. Old King, our people are desperate but not broken. If circumstances shift, we'll remember how to be dangerous rather than merely grateful." The honesty was refreshing after 3 months of diplomatic niceties. Victor acknowledged it with a nod that conveyed respect without submission. The Shadeborn Queen's attention shifted to Maya, still unconscious in his arms. The girl had power and courage. Both rare combination of being so young, Nyx Thera would be watching her development with interest that was neither entirely benevolent nor entirely hostile. Then the Queen dissolved back into shadow, returning to her realm through the closing rift, leaving only the smell of ozone and something floral that had no place in terrestrial biochemistry. Marcus approached as the dimensional residue dissipated that went better than expected. All things considered, only minor disaster rather than catastrophic failure. The dry humor was welcome after the night's intensity. Victor managed something approximating a smile despite exhaustion and silver poisoning still burning through his system. They'd succeeded. The first evacuation was complete. The precedent had been established. Now they'd discover whether success could be replicated or whether tonight's outcome was anomaly rather than blueprint. 6 months passed. Marcus's reign as elected king proved substantially more complicated than he'd anticipated when accepting the position. The transition from military advisor to actual authority revealed gaps in his political education, dealing with economic disputes between vampire territories, managing feeding violation cases that required nuance, rather than simple enforcement, negotiating with human governments, who discovered that vampire populations existed within their jurisdictions. He sat in Victor's study on a February evening looking exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. Governing was harder than killing, required different skills than warfare had ever demanded, and he was failing more often than succeeding despite genuine effort. Victor listened without offering immediate solutions. Sometimes people needed to voice frustration before they could hear advice. Marcus's confession came reluctant. He'd been wrong about Victor for 2 centuries, had assumed that rigid adherence to old ways was weakness, rather than recognizing the incredible burden of maintaining stability while everything around you evolved. The apology carried weight precisely because it came without expectation of absolution. Marcus wasn't seeking forgiveness so much as acknowledging a truth he had been too proud or too angry to admit. Victor's response emerged carefully governing, required different approach now than it had 200 years ago. The world had accelerated beyond what individual rulers could fully comprehend. Perhaps the solution was building systems rather than personalities, creating structures that functioned regardless of who occupied leadership positions. Marcus absorbed this with visible relief. Then Victor would help design those structures, serve as advisor, even though the throne was no longer his. The role reversal had its appeal. Victor had spent 3 centuries bearing ultimate responsibility for every decision. Advising without final authority meant he could speak honestly without worrying that his words became absolute law. The agreement came simply: he'd help where capable, though Marcus should understand that advice, from someone who'd ruled for 220 years, came with biases that might not serve modern circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by urgent report from Seattle. Unauthorized rift had opened not Shadeborn's signature, something different and substantially more threatening. The description that followed made Victor's blood run cold. Void black opening with hints of colors that hurt to perceive, dimensional signature that felt wrong in ways even Shadeborn rifts didn't, and something emerging that defied categorization. Marcus looked to Victor with expression that mixed hope and desperation. Would he come to Seattle provide expertise that the court's current advisors lacked? The request represented everything Victor had been trying to avoid. He'd retired from active operations after the harbor evacuation, spent the intervening months writing his memoir, and attempting to find peace with the idea that his direct involvement was no longer required. But Seattle represented genuine threat, the kind that might require experience only he possessed. Maya entered the study before Victor could respond, moving with confidence that 6 months ago she hadn't possessed. The transformation had completed successfully. She maintained human consciousness while accessing dimensional abilities that made her the most capable bridge in recorded history. She'd heard the Seattle report and was already preparing to deploy. This was her responsibility as Shadow Ambassador. Handling dimensional threats was precisely what the position existed to address. Victor started to object, old protective instincts asserting themselves. Then he caught Marcus, watching him, waiting to see if Victor could actually practice the philosophy he'd been advocating. Let the next generation lead. Trust the training. Step aside when stepping aside served better than continued involvement. The words came harder than expected. Maya should take the Seattle operation. She had capabilities. He lacked dimensional sensitivity that would provide advantages his combat experience couldn't match. Maya's surprise was visible but quickly masked. She'd been expecting argument, preparing counterpoints to anticipated objections. Instead, she simply nodded, accepting the responsibility and the trust it represented. Marcus began coordinating logistics transport to Seattle Church liaison to ensure legal authority and backup forces in case combat became necessary. Maya would lead, but she wouldn't go alone or unsupported. After they left to finalize preparations, Victor remained in his studies, staring at the memoir pages scattered across his desk. 347 years of mistakes and regrets, documented with painful honesty for whoever might read them eventually. James Hartford had told him to build legacy worth remembering. Maya's success was becoming that legacy, proof that training someone properly mattered more than maintaining personal relevance. The realization should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt like loss, the particular emptiness that came from recognizing you were no longer necessary. Perhaps that's what aging actually meant, regardless of whether it occurred across decades or centuries. The Seattle Rift opened in an abandoned industrial district, far enough from civilian population that immediate casualties remained minimal. Maya's team arrived within 4 hours, fast response that would have been impossible before the evacuation operation established operational protocols. Victor watched via a remote feed that Sarah Kane had established camera perspectives showing the rift and surrounding area in real time. He'd promised to stay out of direct operations, but monitoring didn't violate that commitment. The rift was exactly as described, void black opening that seemed to absorb light rather than emitted, edges flickering with colors that made the camera feed distort whenever they appeared. dimensional signature registered on church equipment as something they'd never encountered before. The emissary emerged slowly, taking form from nothing rather than crossing through the rift. Humanoid shape composed of absolute absence, not shadow but void, the space where reality had been removed and nothing rushed in to fill the gap. Its voice emerged as reversed audio words that sounded backwards even as meaning became somehow comprehensible. Finally, the bridge and the old king's student meeting at last. How convenient. Maya stood her ground despite visible fear. What was it? What did it want? Why open rift in violation of established treaties? The emissary's laughter was silence, inverted sound that hurt to process. Treaties meant nothing to entities that existed outside dimensional frameworks. It had watched the evacuation with interest, observed vampire human, shadeborn cooperation, and determined that intervention was required before the alliance solidified further. Its form shifted, becoming clearer, as if reality was learning how to render something. It had no template, for it was the void entropy given consciousness, the heat death of magic itself, and it consumed dimensions the way fire consumed wood. The alliance Maya had helped build was admirable but futile. The void would eventually consume all realities, regardless of cooperation or conflict. Fighting was pointless. Negotiation was meaningless. Extinction was inevitable. But, and here the emissary's tone shifted into something that might have been curiosity, it was not entirely unreasonable. It had watched Maya during the evacuation, seen her innovative approach to dimensional manipulation, recognized potential utility in her hybrid nature. The offer came simply: give the void the bridge girl, allow it to study her unique physiology, and in exchange it would spare Earth and the Shadeborn realm for an indefinite period. One life for billions. The mathematics seemed obvious. Maya's team responded predictably, weapons raising defensive positions, forming absolute rejection of the proposed trade. But the emissary had made the offer, knowing it would be refused. It wanted to force a choice, wanted to see how the alliance responded when pragmatism and ethics came into direct conflict. Victor watched the scene unfold from his study, recognizing the trap even as it closed. The emissary was testing them, determining whether they'd sacrifice individuals for collective safety or maintain principles even when principles carry costs. His phone showed Marcus' call. Victor answered without greeting. Marcus's voice came tense. They needed Victor in Seattle immediately. Maya was refusing to consider the emissary's offer, and the team was preparing for combat that might get everyone killed. Perhaps Victor could negotiate something that preserved both Maya's life and the realm's safety. The request represented everything Victor had been trying to escape: responsibility for impossible decisions, situations where every choice led to catastrophe. He could go to Seattle, could attempt negotiation, could potentially find some third option that Marcus and Maya couldn't see from inside the crisis. Or he could trust Maya to handle it, trust that 6 months of training had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation. James Hartford's final words echoed: teach her when to let go, when to pass responsibility, instead of clinging to power until death forces the issue. Victor's response came quiet but absolute. Maya would handle Seattle without his involvement. She'd been trained precisely for situations where combat and diplomacy intersected, and if she failed, at least the failure would be hers rather than his. Marcus started to protest. Victor ended the call before hearing the objection, trusting that his former friend would understand eventually, even if the understanding came too late. The remote feed continued showing Seattle. Maya had stepped closer to the emissary, dismissing her protective detail with gesture that suggested confidence she might not actually feel. Her voice carried clearly through the audio feed. The emissary's offer was rejected, not because the mathematics were wrong, but because the premise was wrong. Trading individuals for collective safety was the thinking that had created the Northern Province disaster, and that path led only to accumulating atrocities justified by increasingly desperate circumstances. The emissary's form rippled, then Maya accepted that her refusal would result in dimensional consumption, billions dying because she valued personal ethics over practical survival. Maya's response came steady. She accepted that some choices couldn't be made purely through utilitarian calculation, that the moment you started measuring lives against lives, you'd already lost the moral framework that made civilization worth preserving. But she also had alternative to offer. The emissary shifted curiosity, overriding programmed hostility. What alternative could possibly matter to entropy itself? Maya gestured to her team. vampire-human shade-born advisor who'd been included specifically to represent the full alliance. Her words came carefully from the connection that they the void couldn't assume because it existed between entities rather than within them. Bonds formed through cooperation rather than coercion. She wanted to show this emissary something it had never experienced, what it felt like to be part of alliance rather than standing outside observation. The emissary laughed sounded like creation running backwards. It was entropy given consciousness. It didn't form connections, it consumed them along with everything else. Maya's response was simple, then prove it, let them try. If connection failed, then the emissary could return to its original plan. The challenge hung in Seattle's cold air. Victor watched from 3,000 miles away, barely breathing, despite not requiring oxygen, wondering if his apprentice had just saved everything or doomed it through naive idealism. The emissary's form stabilized into something approaching decision. It would permit the attempt partially from curiosity and partially from recognition that Maya's approach represented genuine innovation rather than desperate stalling. Maya turned to her team, explaining quickly they would link hands, create chain, connecting different species, and she'd channel their combined consciousness toward the emissary the way she'd done during the harbor evacuation. Sarah Kane moved into position without hesitation. Marcus arrived via the feed he'd ignored Victor's order and come to Seattle anyway, positioning himself in the chain. The Shade-born advisor joined, human church specialists, vampire guards, a circle of cooperation facing entropy itself. Maya began the channeling purple-silver light, flowing through the linked hands' consciousness, expanding to encompass multiple perspectives simultaneously. Victor couldn't perceive the specific sensations through the camera feed, but he could see the effect, faces showing wonder and pain combined as barriers between individuals dissolved temporarily. What flowed toward the emissary was memory and emotion translated into dimensional language. Victor's 3 centuries of regret and hope, Maya's determination to be better than her predecessors, Marcus's grief transformed into forgiveness, Sarah's loss channeled into prevention, Shade-born desperation met with human compassion. The sum total of connection offered freely to something that had never experienced anything except isolation. The emissary recoiled, form destabilizing as it processed input. It had no framework to categorize what was this, what emotion was being transmitted, what was this sensation of connection that the void couldn't consume. Maya's voice came through the feed, gentle despite exhaustion. That was what they were offering. Not sacrifice, but inclusion. A chance to witness cooperation instead of simply destroying. The emissary's form shifted rapidly, cycling through configurations as if searching for appropriate response. When it finally spoke, the reversed audio had changed, becoming something closer to comprehensible speech. It remembered now fragments surfacing from before entropy. It had been bridge once, first one created by race long extinct, but it had been alone, no teacher, no alliance, no hope. And the isolation had driven it to consume its own reality, trying to find connection, becoming what it most feared. The confession hung heavy. Maya stepped closer despite her team's protests. Then it didn't have to be alone anymore. The alliance was new and fragile, but it was real, and real was better than void. The emissary regarded her with attention that felt like being observed by the universe itself. The alliance would be tested. Circumstances would challenge cooperation, maintaining unity across species. Boundaries required constant effort that would sometimes fail. But perhaps it deserved chance. If they succeeded in building an alliance that could survive internal pressures and external threats, if they demonstrated that cooperation was sustainable rather than temporary anomaly, then the emissary would consider sparing their dimensions. 1 year, prove the model worked, spread it beyond single cities. Then the void would decide whether extinction remained necessary. The emissary dissolved, taking the rift with it, leaving Seattle's industrial district empty, except for the team that had just negotiated with entropy itself. Victor sat in his study watching the feed shift to aftermath, people checking each other for injuries, Sarah coordinating cleanup, Marcus looking simultaneously relieved and disturbed by what had just occurred. Maya stood apart from the group, staring at where the emissary had been expression, showing the weight of understanding exactly what she'd committed them to. 1 year to prove cooperation could survive. 1 year to build something that might save multiple dimensions. No pressure at all. Victor closed the feed and returned to his memoir, adding, "New Section legacy isn't built by individuals refusing to die. Legacy is built by training people capable of succeeding where you would have failed, then having the wisdom to step aside when your continued presence would hinder rather than help. The words felt true even if accepting their truth hurt. 5 years passed faster than decades had during his earlier reign. Victor attended court sessions occasionally, but held no official position, served as advisor when Marcus requested, but initiated no policy himself. The transition from authority to elder statesman had been smoother than expected. Perhaps because he finally learned what James Hartford had tried to teach him. Sometimes the hardest part of leadership was recognizing when you were no longer the person best suited to lead. Maya's Shadow Ambassador program had expanded beyond initial projections. 12 trained bridges now worked across North America, each one managing rift sites and establishing communication protocols with dimensional entities. The catastrophic failures that church leadership had predicted never materialized. Proper training and support structures prevented the isolation that had destroyed previous subjects. The emissary returned periodically, observing rather than threatening, apparently satisfied that the alliance was attempting genuine cooperation rather than performing temporary theater. Its presence remained unsettling, but no longer immediately dangerous. Vampire-human relations had improved incrementally. Sunchurch extremism declined as cooperation proved more effective than conflict. Trade agreements were established, dimensional research facilities opened under joint oversight, tourism industries developed around controlled rift sites. Not utopia. Problems remained: territorial disputes, ideological conflicts, occasional violence when fear overwhelmed rationality. But progress measurable and documented. Victor's memoir had been published to surprising commercial success. Vampires read it as historical record, humans as window into supernatural society, scholars as primary source for Purge Wars research. All proceeds went to memorial funds for rift disaster victims, money that couldn't resurrect the dead, but might prevent future deaths through improved safety protocols. His 352nd birthday arrived with celebration he hadn't requested. Maya had organized a gathering at the estate, 30 people representing the Alliance's various factions unified by shared history and mutual respect. Victor tolerated the attention with grace he'd learned to fake convincingly. Birthdays meant nothing to vampires beyond marking time already excessive, but humans found comfort in ritual acknowledgement. Marcus gave speech about transformation and growth, political rhetoric that nevertheless contained genuine affection underneath the formal language. Sarah presented plaque recognizing Victor's contributions to dimensional diplomacy. The Shadeborn advisor offered gift that translated roughly as gratitude for continued existence. Maya waited until the formal ceremonies concluded before approaching privately. She was being sent to negotiate with the emissary next month. Formal diplomatic exchange to discuss long-term dimensional stability protocols. The mission represented significant responsibility and substantial risk. Victor's instinct was immediate concern, followed quickly by forced recognition that Maya was 22 now, had successfully handled dozens of complex operations, and didn't require his protection, even if some part of him would always see her as the frightened 17-year-old he'd found practicing forbidden magic. His response came carefully neutral. She'd succeed because she always did, had proven herself dozens of times, and the emissary responded better to her than anyone else. Maya smiled with the particular fondness of someone who recognized what wasn't being said underneath polite encouragement. She was terrified, had been terrified during every major operation, but terror was acceptable as long as it didn't prevent action. She'd learned that from him, apparently watching how he functioned during crisis, despite fear that never fully disappeared, regardless of centuries elapsed. The observation surprised him. He'd thought he'd hidden the fear, better maintained the facade of confidence that leadership required. But Maya had been watching carefully, learning not just techniques, but the emotional framework that supported them. Perhaps that was the real teaching. Not magic or combat or political maneuvering, but the understanding that fear and confidence could coexist, that being frightened didn't disqualify you from acting. The party continued around them, conversations flowing in multiple languages and spanning topics from dimensional physics to ideal feeding protocols. The estate that had felt empty for decades now pulsed with life and purpose. Victor excused himself, eventually retreating to his private study, where silence provided relief from celebration's demands. The room remained unchanged despite years passing, same desk, same books, same portrait of his younger self, watching from the wall with expression that suggested judgment or perhaps pity. 352 years. More than enough time to learn every lesson life offered. And yet somehow he kept discovering new understanding, kept finding ways his previous certainties had been incomplete or wrong entirely. The memoir's final page lay on his desk completed weeks ago, but not yet submitted to the publisher for inclusion in future editions. The words looked inadequate now, clumsy attempt to distill centuries into coherent wisdom. But perhaps inadequate was acceptable. Perhaps admitting limits was itself a form of wisdom. The text read simply, "To whoever finds this, I made every mistake possible. Arrogance, pride, fear disguised as strength. But I learned eventually that legacy isn't measured in years survived or battles won. Legacy is measured in what continues after you step aside, in the people you trained who exceeded your capabilities, in the systems you built that functioned without you, in the courage to recognize when your time leading has ended and someone else's has begun. Make better mistakes than I did. Build something worth passing on. And when you're tired, rest. The next generation will carry forward." That's what legacy means. Victor read the words once more, then filed them with satisfaction that felt like closure. James Hartford would have approved, would have said that understanding finally arrived even if it took 3.5 centuries to get there. A knock interrupted his contemplation. Maya stood in the doorway, expression suggesting the party had concluded and people were departing. Did Victor want to say goodbyes? He declined, letting her handle the social pleasantries while he remained in his study. Some privileges of age included avoiding extended farewells. Maya lingered after delivering the message. She wanted to thank him properly, away from public observation and performance expectations. The gratitude was unnecessary, but Victor let her continue, recognizing the need to speak it aloud. Maya's words came honest and direct. She'd been nobody before finding Aldrich's book, invisible, servant daughter, with future consisting of cleaning floors until age made that impossible. And Victor had given her chance to become something more. Taught her not just magic, but the framework to use power responsibly. And most critically, shown her that making mistakes didn't mean being failure as long as you learned from them. The speech was articulate and genuine and made Victor deeply uncomfortable in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He'd simply done what seemed necessary at the time, train her or execute her, and training had seemed slightly less catastrophic. But looking at Maya now, confident, competent, respected across multiple species, as legitimate authority, he recognized that necessity had somehow produced legacy worth claiming. His response came quieter than intended. She taught him equally valuable lessons, reminded him that rigid certainty was weakness rather than strength, shown him that the next generation's innovations mattered more than preserving the previous generation's traditions. They taught each other. That's what made it partnership rather than simple hierarchy. Maya accepted the acknowledgement with a nod that conveyed understanding beyond her years. Then she left, returning to her own quarters in the preparations for next month's diplomatic mission. Victor remained alone, watching moonlight through the study windows, feeling weight of 352 years settle comfortably rather than oppressively. The world would continue its indifferent rotation regardless of his participation. Maya and Marcus and Sarah would handle threats and opportunities with capabilities he no longer needed to provide. The alliance would face challenges that required innovation rather than experience. And he would rest finally after 3 centuries of fighting battles that never quite ended. Would write and observe and offer counsel when requested but not demanded. Would let someone else carry the burden of impossible decisions and discover their own paths to wisdom or failure. Legacy complete, story concluded. Life still continuing, but on terms that felt sustainable rather than exhausting. Victor Ashford, 352 years old, finally at peace. The observatory tower stood empty under winter star's glass dome, framing constellations that had witnessed humanity's entire history and would witness its continuation or extinction with equal indifference. Victor climbed the spiral stairs on a February night, moving slower than decades previous, but still functional, still capable. He stood where he'd first offered Maya apprenticeship 5 years ago, where crisis and opportunity had intersected in a decision that changed everything. The pedestal where Aldrich's book had rested remained bare. Maya kept the grimoire, now used it as reference, but no longer required it as teacher. The transformation was complete, stable, successful beyond what anyone had predicted. Outside, Portland lights stretched toward Ocean City that had been his home for 2 centuries, territory he'd defended and ruled and eventually learned to share. The vampires who lived there now answered to Marcus's authority rather than his followed policies. He'd had minimal input, creating built futures that didn't require his participation. The observation should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like release, the particular satisfaction that came from recognizing your work was finished and finishing was acceptable. Victor's phone buzzed with message from Maya. Negotiations with the emissary had concluded successfully. Dimensional stability protocols established for next decade alliance recognized as legitimate framework by entities that existed outside normal reality. Success built on success. Legacy extending beyond his capacity to track or control. He responded with brief congratulations, then set the phone aside and simply stood in observatory silence alone, with stars and memories, the understanding that 352 years was enough. Not that he planned to die. Vampire biology didn't allow for casual suicide, even if he'd wanted it. But enough meaning he no longer needed to define himself through action could exist in contemplation and observation, could let the story continue without requiring his constant involvement. The next generation was ready. The systems were functional. The Alliance would face challenges, but possessed tools to address them. His part was complete. Victor descended from the observatory as dawn approached, returning to his quarters and the artificial darkness that made daylight tolerable. He lay down without bothering to undress, exhaustion finally catching up to him after nights spent in reflection. Sleep came easily, the deep rest that vampires rarely achieved, consciousness dimming into something approaching peace. When he woke 12 hours later, the world had continued rotating. Maya had sent updates about dimensional research breakthroughs. Marcus requested consultation on economic policy. Sarah reported that church leadership was considering formal recognition of hybrid rights. The work continued. Different work now, building rather than defending, creating rather than protecting. Victor read the messages and responded thoughtfully, offering perspective without demanding authority, contributing without control. Legacy in practice rather than theory. 352 years. And finally understanding what mattered. Not the throne or the title or the power accumulated over centuries. Not the battles won or enemies defeated or crises survived. What mattered was stepping aside gracefully when stepping aside served better than continued presence. Training people capable of exceeding your capabilities. Building systems that functioned after you'd gone. James Harford had tried to teach him that 3 years ago, used his final words to communicate what Victor had been too stubborn to hear during the preceding 3 decades. Better late than never apparently applied even to lessons learned across centuries. Victor closed his laptop and moved to the study window, watching afternoon sun paint Portland in gold and shadow. Beautiful despite the discomfort it caused his biology. The world was changing, would continue changing regardless of whether he approved or resisted. But the change was good, progress rather than decline, evolution rather than extinction. And he'd contributed to that, trained the people making it possible, built a framework allowing it to occur. Legacy complete. Story told. Peace finally achieved. Victor Ashford smiled and let the sunset wash over him, accepting both the pain and the beauty, surrendering to the understanding that some things were worth the discomfort of experiencing them fully. 352 years, worth living, worth remembering, worth finally letting rest.